Star Wars is probably the world's premier intellectual property, or IP. The world of George Lucas has taken over movies, comics, books, theme parks, conventions, and maybe most of all, video games. So much of Star Wars culture overlaps with that of the video game culture. Unfortunately, I'm mostly out of the loop when it comes to video games. That's why I reached out to Chris Baker, former LucasArts studio publicist and all-around video game guru, to discuss not only the prequel roles in Star Wars games, but the overall impact of George Lucas's saga on the video game industry. First, I wanted to know how the Star Wars games stacked up from the prequel era.
If you're a gamer now versus like in 2002 or whatever, games are just more advanced now, and it's harder in general to go back and play a game from the early PlayStation 2 era or something like that. But, that said, like if you're interested in like Jango Fett's backstory or something, there's, a Star Wars Bounty Hunter to play there. Some of the games aren't really that great and are probably best forgotten, like Obi-Wan on Xbox, not a very good game, even though it was kind of touted as a big Xbox exclusive at the time. And then there's stuff like Lego Star Wars. The first Lego Star Wars game was completely a prequel trilogy game, and that not only started one of the more popular Star Wars series in Lego Star Wars. Lego became a huge juggernaut for IP-related video games. So there's definitely good stuff from then, but if you're just asking, like, is there a reason to go back and play the prequel games if you don't like the prequels? I think the answer is really no.
Fair enough, but this generalizes to most Star Wars games. If you don't like any Star Wars movies, most of the games won't hold up on their own. Though I quickly learned whether or not you like Star Wars. Many of the Star Wars video games had a huge impact on the game industry.
There are genuine innovations in video games that have come through Star Wars games. Dark Forces, that wasn't by any means the first-person shooter or anything, but it did do things like incorporate story as a big part in a first-person shooter. I think it was the first game you could actually crouch in a first-person shooter and maybe even jump. I could be wrong there, but it was among the very first. If that's the case, if that's not the case, you could look up and shoot. That was a fairly new innovation for first-person shooters back then. Then you have games like X-Wing versus TIE Fighter, which is one of the very first games that relied very heavily on online play. In fact, it was pretty much exclusively an online game in 1997 when not a lot of people had those capabilities. I don't know if I'd call it an innovation, but Knights of the Old Republic has one of the greatest plot twists in the history of video games. And it's something that really only a video game can do.
Knights of the Old Republic. I knew eventually we would get into it. It's technically a prequel game, but to be clear, it has nothing to do with the Lucas trilogy. Instead, it takes place thousands of years before the Star Wars films. Not only is it beloved by Star Wars fans, it's widely acclaimed by the video game industry. If you don't know the story, just a heads up, we are breaching major spoiler territory.
So what happens in Knights of the Old Republic, if you haven't played it, is you play probably a good 30 hours or so of this role-playing game, getting to know this character who's lost his memory. He's working with other Jedi against a Sith threat. And the whole time you keep hearing about this awful Sith Lord named Darth Revan. 30 hours in, you learn the truth about your identity, and you are Darth Revan. The thing that makes that so special as a video game is you literally were that character for such a long investment in time. It's one thing to see that in a movie where you come to know and love characters over a couple of hours, but to actually be that character for, dozens of hours before you learn this really earth-shattering moment, it's really amazing storytelling.
The more I discussed Star Wars games with Chris, the more I began to realize a theme. In many ways, Star Wars is the defining IP of the video game industry. A lot of this has to do with timing, as Chris explains.
Star Wars as everyone watching this knows, was a hugely revolutionary in terms of, making the blockbuster a thing, the Hollywood blockbuster a thing, making us fall in love with merchandising, for example. And, the game started out as toys, basically. They started out as merchandising, but, games also on their own are also about the same age of Star Wars. The Atari came out in 1977 as well, and that I would say that's like really when gaming hit the map. So you have like these two like really cool, really revolutionary things kind of coming together in a way that really no other IP or no other property could at the time.
As the young video game industry developed, Star Wars was there every step of the way. You can place major Star Wars releases side by side the history of gaming, and you'll find Star Wars games often serve as milestones in the art. Sometimes the Star Wars games are part of the video game trend of its time, but more often than not, Star Wars games were ahead of the curve.
The very first Star Wars game in 1982 was The Empire Strikes Back on Atari 2600. It adapted the Battle of Hoth into a video game, taking an actual iconic scene from a film and letting you live that. That's been done time and time again since, but at that point, like 1982, that was a pretty new idea. Like any kind of licensed game would take an alien from Alien and make him in a Pac-Man maze or something. It wasn't an iconic scene from Alien. It was just taking that IP and applying it to some other kind of game that it's ripping off. Whereas The Empire Strikes Back actually had you controlling a speeder against AT-ATs coming at you. In 1983, you had the arcade game where, you just go and you blow up the Death Star. And you could do it within 5 minutes most of the time. It included clips from the film, like, I've lost R2, and, may the Force be with you. Like, it actually included lines from the film. It may have been the first game to do that. Most games didn't talk at all back then. Like, just talking in a game was a pretty amazing thing. Like Star Wars, the mid-'80s were pretty rough for video games too. Then Nintendo came along and made video games cool again. And then by the early 90s, when Star Wars started to get cool again, that's when video games started picking up for Star Wars again. I think Super Star Wars actually made a huge impact. That was like when Star Wars really was starting to come back. There was this huge push behind Super Star Wars, and that whole trilogy kind of came out over the course of 3 years or so. Really hard, but mostly very good games. Most people will say that. A lot of people won't too. I think Star Wars, like in terms of games, like has a very unique advantage that I really can't think of any other property, because it is, like I said, it's like the coming of age of the most popular entertainment franchise and the most cutting edge form of media coming together at once, and you can only do that one time.
Before I let Chris go, I wanted to ask him one last question. What did he think the future has in store for the Star Wars prequels in the video game industry?
I think the prequels will affect video games in the future the way they affect everything else. The newest game coming out right now is Star Wars Battlefront 2 from EA. And all of the Battlefronts from the very beginning have always kind of integrated both classic and prequel into the whole picture. So you're if you're playing the latest and greatest games, you're kind of getting it whether you want it or not. The prequels are Star Wars now, whether some fans like it or not. And I think actually a lot of fans have come to accept the mythology of the prequels. Like, they see a battle droid and they're mostly cool with it now, And when I say fans, I mean the fans who hate the prequels, because people like myself at least respect them, and I do enjoy watching them. Will we see another prequel game? I don't think so. I mean, I don't think we'll see anything like firmly set between episodes 1 and 3.
And you know what? That's okay. Because either way, it's clear Star Wars has made a major impact on the video game industry. As video games continue to develop into one of culture's primary entertainment and artistic mediums, the galaxy far, far away is open for all kinds of exciting opportunities.